You're a young woman in medieval England, and you've just received news that should fill you with joy. The king has chosen you for marriage to one of his most powerful lords. Your family celebrates, counting the gold that will flow into their coffers. But as you sit in your chamber that night, staring at the flickering candle flame, a cold dread settles in your stomach like a stone. You understand what they don't want to admit. This isn't about love or even political alliance. This is about your womb. Your body has become a battlefield in a war you never chose to fight, and the weapons being used against you are laws, customs, and traditions so deeply woven into society that they seem as natural as breathing. You realize with growing horror that every aspect of your existence from this moment forward will be controlled, monitored, and manipulated by men who will never need to lay a hand on you to own you completely. Your monthly cycles will be tracked by servants. Your diet will be regulated to ensure fertility. Your clothing will be chosen to advertise your availability or signal your status as property. Even your prayers will be dictated, as priests tell you exactly which saints to petition for a fruitful marriage. This was the reality for countless women throughout the medieval period, trapped in a system so sophisticated and complete that it could control female bodies without requiring physical force. The medieval world had perfected something far more insidious than simple violence. They had created a web of social, legal, and religious controls that made women complicit in their own subjugation. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoyed learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of medieval oppression. It's the blueprint for how power structures can control entire populations without appearing overtly violent. The techniques developed in medieval Europe were so effective that their echoes still reverberate through modern society, influencing how we think about women's bodies, autonomy, and choice. The medieval period wasn't just a time when women had fewer rights. It was an era when an entire civilization developed systematic methods for turning women's bodies into instruments of political and economic control. These weren't crude or primitive techniques. They were sophisticated, psychologically devastating, and remarkably effective at achieving their goals. The story begins with something deceptively simple: marriage law. But this wasn't marriage as we understand it today, with concepts of mutual consent and partnership. Medieval marriage was a legal transaction that transferred ownership of a woman's body from her father to her husband, along with everything that body could produce. Children, labor, sexual availability, even the woman's death all became the property of the man who possessed her. The genius of this system lay in how it made control seem natural and divinely ordained. Women weren't being oppressed, they were told. They were being protected, cherished, and given their highest purpose in life. The very laws that stripped them of autonomy were presented as gifts, privileges that elevated them above the common concerns of men who had to worry about politics and warfare. Consider the legal concept of coverture, which literally meant that a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even testify in court without his permission. But this wasn't presented as oppression, it was protection. Why should a delicate female mind be burdened with such complex matters when her husband could handle them for her? The psychological brilliance of this approach cannot be overstated. By framing control as protection, medieval society created a system where women policed themselves. They internalized the belief that their bodies were too valuable and too dangerous to be left under their own control. A woman who tried to assert autonomy over her own flesh wasn't just breaking laws, she was endangering her immortal soul and threatening the stability of civilization itself. The church played a crucial role in this elaborate deception. Medieval Christianity developed a complex theology around women's bodies that managed to simultaneously venerate and despise them. The female form was sacred because it could create life, but it was also cursed because it had brought sin into the world. This contradiction created a perfect justification for total control. Women's bodies were too holy to be defiled by their own choices, yet too corrupted by original sin to be trusted with self-governance. Every menstrual cycle was a reminder of Eve's transgression. Every pregnancy was both a blessing and a punishment. This theological framework meant that controlling women wasn't just politically expedient, it was a religious duty. The practical implementation of this control was breathtakingly comprehensive. Medieval society developed monitoring systems that would make modern surveillance states envious. A woman's reproductive cycle wasn't private information. It was tracked by servants, reported to husbands, and analyzed by physicians who claimed to understand the mysteries of female anatomy better than women themselves. The food a woman ate was regulated based on her reproductive status. During certain times of the month, specific foods were forbidden because they might interfere with conception. During pregnancy, elaborate dietary rules governed every meal. Even outside of marriage, young women's diets were controlled to ensure they would be fertile when the time came for them to fulfill their biological destiny. Clothing became another instrument of control. The garments women wore weren't just fashion choices, they were advertisements of their sexual and reproductive status. Unmarried women wore certain colors and styles that proclaimed their availability. Married women's clothing announced their ownership by displaying their husband's wealth and status. Widows were required to dress in ways that made their diminished value immediately apparent to everyone who saw them. The sophistication extended to emotional and psychological manipulation that would impress modern advertisers. Medieval literature, art, and popular culture created a narrative about women's proper role that was so pervasive, it became reality. Stories of virtuous women always featured characters who found joy and fulfillment in submission. Tales of rebellious women invariably ended in tragedy, serving as warnings about the consequences of challenging the natural order. Religious festivals and ceremonies reinforced these messages through ritual and symbolism. Young women participated in celebrations that prepared them for their future roles as wives and mothers. The pageantry was beautiful, the traditions meaningful, but the underlying message was always the same. Your body exists to serve purposes determined by others. Perhaps most insidiously, the system created artificial scarcity around women's choices to make limited options seem like privileges. A woman who was allowed to choose between two suitors felt grateful for her freedom, even though both choices led to the same destination: complete surrender of bodily autonomy. A wife who was consulted about household decisions felt valued and respected, even though the most fundamental decisions about her own flesh remained beyond her control. The economic structures of medieval society ensured that resistance was practically impossible. Women had no independent means of survival. They couldn't own property, practice most trades, or support themselves without male protection. This economic dependence wasn't an accident. It was carefully constructed to ensure that even women who questioned the system had no practical alternative to submission. The legal framework complemented these economic controls perfectly. Laws governing adultery, for example, weren't really about protecting marriage. They were about protecting property rights and women's reproductive capacity. A woman who had sex outside marriage wasn't just sinning. She was stealing from her husband or father by potentially creating children whose paternity was uncertain. These property rights extended even to women's deaths. Widows couldn't remarry without permission because their deceased husband's family retained interest in their reproductive potential. A woman's womb belonged to her husband's lineage even after he was gone, ensuring that any future children would serve the interests of his family rather than her own. The system's genius lay in how it made alternatives literally unthinkable. Medieval women weren't oppressed by force, they were controlled by the complete absence of any conceivable alternative. The idea that a woman might control her own body wasn't just illegal or immoral. It was intellectually impossible within the medieval worldview. This psychological control was reinforced through constant surveillance disguised as care and concern. A woman's female relatives, friends, and servants all became unwitting agents of the system, monitoring her behavior and reporting any signs of inappropriate independence. The watchers themselves were watched, creating a network of mutual surveillance that made privacy impossible and rebellion unthinkable. The medical establishment provided scientific justification for these controls through theories about female anatomy that conveniently supported political and social arrangements. Women's bodies were declared inherently unstable, prone to hysteria and irrationality that made self-governance dangerous. These weren't just prejudices, they were presented as objective medical facts discovered through careful study. The result was a system of control so complete and so psychologically sophisticated that its victims often became its most enthusiastic defenders. Women who had internalized these beliefs genuinely believed they were protecting other women by enforcing the same restrictions that had been imposed on them. The oppressed became the oppressors, ensuring the system's perpetuation across generations. But understanding how this system worked is only the beginning of our story. What we need to explore next is how these mechanisms of control played out in the lives of real women, how some found ways to resist despite impossible odds, and how the techniques perfected in medieval Europe evolved into forms of control that persist today in ways that might shock you. The young woman sitting in her chamber that night, contemplating her upcoming marriage, represents millions of women whose stories were never recorded, whose resistance was never acknowledged, and whose humanity was systematically erased by systems designed to transform them into instruments of others' will. Her story is about to become far more complex and far more tragic than she could possibly imagine. The wedding preparations begin immediately, and with them comes the first lesson in how control operates through ceremony and spectacle. You're fitted for your wedding dress by seamstresses who measure not just your body, but your worth. The fabric chosen isn't based on your preferences, but on complex calculations involving your father's wealth, your future husband's status, and the political message your union is meant to convey to other noble families. Every detail of your appearance is scrutinized and adjusted by people who speak about you as if you're not present. The seamstresses discuss how the dress should emphasize your fertility while maintaining appropriate modesty. Your mother and aunts debate which jewelry will best advertise your family's prosperity without appearing vulgar. Even your hairstyle becomes a matter of political negotiation, as different arrangements signal different messages about your purity, availability, and the prestige of the families being united. But the most insidious aspect of these preparations is how they're presented as celebrations of your importance and value. Everyone tells you how fortunate you are, how honored you should feel, how this day will be the most important of your life. The elaborate attention to detail is framed as evidence of how precious you are, when in reality it's the methodical process of transforming you from a person into a symbol. The wedding ceremony itself becomes a masterclass in public theater designed to normalize the transfer of ownership. Every ritual, every vow, every gesture has been carefully crafted to make this transaction appear sacred rather than commercial. You promise to obey your husband in language that sounds romantic and religious, while he promises to protect and cherish you in terms that sound generous but actually define the limits of his new property rights. The guests witness this exchange with approval and celebration, reinforcing the social consensus that what's happening is natural and good. Their presence serves as both validation and warning. They're celebrating your submission while simultaneously noting that they'll be watching to ensure you fulfill your new obligations properly. The wedding feast becomes your first public performance as owned property, where your behavior will be scrutinized for signs of appropriate gratitude and submission. After the ceremony, the bedding ritual strips away any remaining illusions about consent or personal autonomy. The same community that just celebrated your marriage now participates in ensuring its consummation, treating your sexual availability as a matter of public interest rather than private intimacy. Witnesses escort you to the marriage bed, and their expectations make clear that your body's primary function is now reproductive service. The months following your wedding reveal the full scope of how this system operates in daily life. Your household becomes a carefully orchestrated surveillance network where your every action is monitored and reported. Your ladies-in-waiting aren't just companions. They're intelligence agents whose job is to track your menstrual cycles, note any changes in your appetite or mood, and report anything that might indicate pregnancy or its absence. Your husband doesn't need to be physically present to control your body because the entire social structure does it for him. Servants monitor your food to ensure you're eating fertility-enhancing ingredients during your fertile periods and avoiding foods thought to prevent conception. Your schedule is arranged to maximize opportunities for pregnancy while minimizing activities that might be considered harmful to your reproductive potential. Even your spiritual life becomes subject to reproductive control. Your confessor guides your prayers towards saints, specifically associated with fertility and childbearing. Your religious observances are timed to coincide with your menstrual cycle, creating a calendar where your body's natural rhythms become synchronized with religious obligations, designed to reinforce your primary purpose as a vessel for creating heirs. The psychological pressure is relentless but subtle. Instead of crude threats or obvious coercion, you face constant gentle reminders about your duties and expectations. Conversations with other women invariably turn to children, pregnancy, and the joys of motherhood. Stories you hear always feature women who found happiness through successful childbearing or tragedy through failure to produce heirs. Your reading material is carefully selected to reinforce these messages. The books available to you tell stories of virtuous women who achieved greatness through their wombs rather than their minds. Religious texts are chosen to emphasize passages about female submission and reproductive duty, while omitting or downplaying sections that might suggest alternative paths for women's spiritual development. The medical establishment provides scientific legitimacy for this comprehensive control through elaborate theories about female anatomy that justify every restriction. Physicians explain that women's bodies are fundamentally different from men's, not just physically but mentally and spiritually. These differences, they claim, make women naturally suited for reproductive roles while making them inherently unsuitable for independence or self-governance. These medical theories create a closed logical system where any sign of female independence or resistance becomes evidence of illness requiring treatment. A woman who questions her reproductive obligations must be suffering from hysteria caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. A woman who shows interest in intellectual pursuits is displaying symptoms of an overheated brain that threatens her fertility. A woman who resists sexual advances from her husband is demonstrating the kind of unnatural coldness that requires medical intervention. The treatments for these supposed ailments invariably involve reasserting control over women's bodies through dietary restrictions, physical restraints, or religious interventions designed to restore proper feminine submission. The medical establishment thus becomes another instrument of control, using the language of healing to justify further restrictions on women's autonomy. Your daily routine becomes a carefully choreographed performance of appropriate femininity. You wake to servants who dress you in clothes chosen to display your husband's wealth and your own reproductive potential. Your meals are prepared according to principles designed to optimize your fertility. Your activities are selected to maintain your health for childbearing while avoiding pursuits that might develop your independence or intellectual capacity. Even your friendships are subject to manipulation and control. The women you're allowed to spend time with are carefully chosen to reinforce approved messages about female roles and expectations. Conversations are subtly guided toward topics that celebrate motherhood and submission, while avoiding subjects that might encourage questioning or resistance. The isolation is particularly devastating because it's disguised as social connection. You're surrounded by people all day, but none of them see you as a complete human being with independent thoughts, desires, and aspirations. They see you as a reproductive vessel whose thoughts and feelings matter only insofar as they affect your ability to fulfill your biological function. Your correspondence is monitored and controlled under the guise of protecting your reputation and ensuring appropriate feminine modesty. Letters you send are read before delivery to ensure they don't contain inappropriate thoughts or requests. Letters you receive are screened to prevent exposure to ideas that might encourage independence or resistance. The economic dimensions of this control become increasingly apparent as you realize that every aspect of your material existence depends on your reproductive performance. Your clothing, food, housing, and personal possessions are all contingent on maintaining your husband's approval through successful fulfillment of your biological obligations. The threat of losing these comforts doesn't need to be stated explicitly because the connection between reproductive success and material security is built into the structure of daily life. Your legal status as a non-person becomes evident in countless small ways that accumulate into complete powerlessness. You cannot make purchases without permission, cannot travel without escort, cannot make decisions about your own medical care, and cannot even choose your own spiritual advisors. These restrictions aren't presented as punishments, but as natural consequences of your feminine nature and evidence of the protection and care being provided by the men who control your life. The system's psychological sophistication becomes most apparent in how it makes you complicit in your own oppression. You find yourself policing your own thoughts and behaviors according to internalized standards that serve your controller's interest rather than your own. You begin to feel guilty for having independent thoughts, ashamed of desires that don't align with your reproductive function, and anxious about any behavior that might be interpreted as insufficiently feminine or submissive. This self-surveillance becomes so complete that external monitoring becomes almost unnecessary. You've internalized the Watcher so thoroughly that you monitor yourself more effectively than any external system could. You've become both prisoner and guard in a jail, constructed from social expectations, religious obligations, and medical theories that all conspire to convince you that your captivity is actually freedom. The brilliance of this system lies in how it makes resistance not just difficult, but literally unthinkable. You can't rebel against controls you don't recognize as controls. You can't fight oppression that's been successfully disguised as protection, care, and divine will. You can't escape a prison when you've been convinced that the cell is actually a palace and the chains are actually jewelry. But some women did find ways to see through the deception, to recognize the system for what it truly was, and to develop forms of resistance that worked within or around its constraints. Their stories reveal both the system's weaknesses and the terrible price paid by those who dared to challenge it. The most dangerous women in medieval society weren't the ones who openly rebelled. Those were quickly crushed by the system's overwhelming force. The truly dangerous women were those who learned to manipulate the very mechanisms designed to control them, turning the system's own logic against itself, while maintaining the appearance of perfect submission. Take the case of Matilda of Tuscany, who discovered that pregnancy could be weaponized in ways her male controllers never anticipated. When political circumstances required her to delay producing an heir, she began timing her intimate relations with mathematical precision, using knowledge of her own cycles that her husband's physicians claimed to possess but actually understood far less completely than she did. She could appear to be fulfilling her reproductive duties while actually maintaining control over when and whether conception occurred. But Matilda's resistance went deeper than mere family planning. She realized that the system's obsession with her reproductive capacity created blind spots she could exploit. While everyone focused intensely on her womb, they paid less attention to her mind. She began cultivating relationships with scholars, merchants, and political figures under the guise of ensuring her future children would inherit valuable connections and knowledge. These conversations, officially about preparing for motherhood, actually became her political education. She learned about trade routes, military tactics, and diplomatic strategies by asking questions framed as concerns about her children's future inheritance. Her controllers encouraged these discussions because they seemed to demonstrate appropriate maternal instincts, never realizing they were providing her with the knowledge she would later use to outmaneuver them. The correspondence network Matilda developed reveals how some women created underground channels of communication that operated parallel to official surveillance systems. Letters between women about pregnancy symptoms, child-rearing advice, and domestic concerns carried coded information about political developments, economic opportunities, and strategic alliances. The very topics that men dismissed as trivial feminine chatter became the foundation for sophisticated intelligence networks. These networks operated on the principle that men's contempt for women's supposed interests created zones of invisibility where real power could be cultivated. A gathering of women to discuss embroidery patterns might actually be a strategic planning session. A recipe exchange could contain coded instructions for everything from contraception to poison. A prayer circle might serve as cover for political organizing that would be impossible in any other context. The medical establishment's theories about female anatomy created another unexpected avenue for resistance. Since women's bodies were supposedly mysterious and unpredictable, symptoms could be manufactured or exaggerated to avoid unwanted obligations. A woman could claim her physician had prescribed rest during certain times of the month, effectively creating periods of autonomy disguised as medical necessity. Some women became experts in the very medical theories used to control them, learning to speak the language of humoral imbalance and feminine delicacy so convincingly that they could prescribe their own treatments. They would cite the same authorities their male controllers revered, using medical terminology to justify behaviors that would otherwise be seen as rebellion. The religious dimension of control also created opportunities for subversion that the system's architects never anticipated. Convents, originally designed as repositories for women who couldn't be married off advantageously, became centers of learning and relative independence that some women actively sought. The choice between marriage and religious life, intended to be no choice at all, became a way for some women to escape the most direct forms of reproductive control. Even within marriage, religious obligations could be manipulated to create spaces of autonomy. Extended pilgrimages, religious retreats, and spiritual observances could remove women from direct supervision for weeks or months at a time. Some women became so skilled at leveraging religious requirements that they spent more time outside their husband's direct control than within it. The economic aspects of the system also contained vulnerabilities that clever women learned to exploit. Since married women officially couldn't own property or conduct business, some developed elaborate networks of male proxies who would act on their behalf while officially making their own decisions. These arrangements required tremendous trust and careful coordination, but they allowed some women to accumulate wealth and influence that remained invisible to official oversight. Widowhood, despite its many restrictions, created temporary windows of opportunity that some women used to devastating effect. The period between a husband's death and remarriage, when a woman was technically under male guardianship but practically autonomous, could be leveraged to restructure assets, form new alliances, and position herself for greater independence in whatever arrangement came next. The most sophisticated resistance involved women who learned to make the system serve their own interests while appearing to submit to it completely. They would use their roles as mothers to influence their sons' education and political development, essentially raising the next generation of male authorities to be more sympathetic to women's interests. They would leverage their positions as wives to influence their husband's business and political decisions, becoming the power behind the throne while maintaining plausible deniability about their influence. These women understood that direct confrontation with the system was suicidal, but indirect manipulation could be incredibly effective. They learned to phrase their desires as concerns for their family's welfare, their suggestions as humble requests for guidance, and their demands as expressions of feminine worry that required masculine reassurance. The psychological sophistication required for this kind of resistance was enormous. Women had to maintain perfect performances of submission while simultaneously working to undermine the very system they appeared to support. They had to remember which persona to present to which audience, keeping track of complex webs of deception that could unravel catastrophically if they made a single mistake. The price of discovery was always severe. Women caught manipulating the system faced punishments designed not just to destroy them, but to serve as warnings to others. Public humiliation, economic ruin, social ostracism, and physical violence were all tools used to demonstrate what happened to women who dared to resist their designated roles. But perhaps the most devastating punishment was the erasure of these women's stories from historical records. Male chroniclers had no interest in documenting female resistance that might inspire others to similar rebellion. The few accounts that survive often come from sources trying to discredit these women, portraying their intelligence and independence as evidence of moral corruption or supernatural evil. The witchcraft accusations that periodically swept through medieval Europe served as ultimate weapons against women who had become too successful at manipulating the system. Any woman who demonstrated unusual knowledge, influence, or independence could find herself accused of supernatural powers that explained her unnatural success. These accusations served both to eliminate specific threats and to reinforce the message that women who exceeded their designated roles must be in league with evil forces. The economic disruption caused by these periodic purges reveals how effective female resistance actually was. If women had truly been as powerless and submissive as the official narrative suggested, there would have been no need for such dramatic interventions to restore male authority. The very violence of these responses demonstrates that the system of control was never as complete or effective as its architects claimed. The legacy of medieval resistance strategies can be traced through centuries of women's movements that use similar techniques of working within oppressive systems while gradually undermining them. The suffragettes who used their status as moral guardians of society to argue for political rights, the women who entered professions by claiming their feminine nature made them specially suited for certain kinds of work, and the activists who leveraged their roles as mothers to justify involvement in social causes were all drawing on strategies pioneered by medieval women who learned to turn their oppression into opportunity. Understanding these historical resistance patterns reveals something crucial about how systems of control actually function. They're never as total or effective as they appear from the outside. Every system of oppression creates its own contradictions and vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand its logic well enough to manipulate it. The medieval system's obsession with controlling women's bodies ultimately became its weakness. By focusing so intensely on reproductive capacity, it created blind spots around women's intellectual and political development that some women learned to exploit brilliantly. By insisting that women were naturally suited only for domestic concerns, it inadvertently created spaces where women could develop skills and networks that could later be turned to other purposes. The religious justifications for female subordination contained theological contradictions that educated women could use to argue for different interpretations of divine will. The legal frameworks that made women property also created property rights that clever women could sometimes manipulate to their advantage. The medical theories that declared women inherently unstable also provided excuses for behaviors that might otherwise be seen as rebellious. But perhaps most importantly, the system's insistence on presenting oppression as protection created a fundamental contradiction that some women learned to exploit. If male control was really about protecting women from their own weaknesses, then women who could demonstrate strength and competence were logically entitled to greater autonomy. If feminine nature was really about nurturing and moral guidance, then women had not just the right, but the obligation to influence the men around them toward more virtuous behavior. These contradictions in the system's own logic provided the intellectual foundations for resistance movements that would eventually challenge and ultimately overthrow many of the medieval period's most oppressive institutions. The women who learned to navigate these contradictions weren't just surviving their circumstances, they were laying the groundwork for future generations who would have greater freedom and opportunity. But the cost of this resistance was enormous, both for the women who attempted it and for those who chose not to take such risks. The psychological toll of living a double life, the constant fear of discovery, the isolation that came from being unable to trust anyone completely, and the knowledge that failure meant not just personal destruction, but the reinforcement of oppressive systems for other women. All of these burdens weighed on women who dared to resist. The majority of women, faced with these impossible choices, chose survival over resistance. They internalized the system's messages about their proper roles, found whatever happiness they could within its constraints, and passed its expectations on to their daughters. This wasn't cowardice, it was a rational response to circumstances where rebellion carried terrible risks and offered uncertain rewards. Understanding the full scope of medieval control mechanisms and the various ways women responded to them provides crucial context for recognizing how similar systems operate in our own time, often in forms so subtle and normalized that they become invisible to those they're designed to control. The echoes of these medieval control systems reverberate through modern society in ways that would shock those who believe we've moved beyond such primitive oppression. The techniques perfected centuries ago didn't disappear. They evolved, becoming more sophisticated, more subtle, and arguably more effective than their medieval predecessors ever were. Today's mechanisms of control operate through the same fundamental principle that made medieval systems so devastatingly effective. They convince women that their subjugation is actually empowerment, that their limitations are actually choices, and that their compliance is actually rebellion. The modern world has simply learned to package these messages in the language of liberation rather than protection, Consider how contemporary society approaches women's reproductive choices. On the surface, we celebrate the autonomy that modern women supposedly possess: the right to choose when and whether to have children, access to contraception and family planning resources, and legal protections against the most overt forms of reproductive coercion. But look deeper, and you'll find control mechanisms that would impress medieval church authorities with their psychological sophistication. The modern beauty industry operates on principles that medieval seamstresses would recognize immediately. Women's bodies are still constantly monitored, measured, and modified according to standards set by others. The difference is that today's standards change rapidly and contradictorily, creating a system where compliance is impossible and failure is guaranteed. Medieval women faced pressure to conform to relatively stable ideals of feminine appearance. Modern women face an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of expectations that ensures perpetual inadequacy and constant consumption of products promising to fix their supposed defects. The medieval practice of tracking women's reproductive cycles through servants and physicians has evolved into apps and devices that women voluntarily use to monitor their own bodies with a precision that would astound medieval doctors. This self-surveillance is marketed as empowerment. Knowledge is power, women are told. But the data collected serves the same function as medieval monitoring systems. It creates detailed records of women's most intimate biological processes that can be accessed, analyzed, and potentially used against them by others. Social media platforms have created surveillance networks that dwarf anything medieval society could have imagined. Women voluntarily document their daily lives, their thoughts, their relationships, and their bodies for public consumption and judgment. The constant feedback loop of likes, comments, and shares creates a form of social control that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with an effectiveness that medieval communities could never have achieved through gossip and social pressure alone. The workplace has become another arena where medieval control techniques have been refined and modernized. Women are told they can have it all: career success and family fulfillment. But the practical structures of modern life make this combination nearly impossible for most women. The resulting stress, exhaustion, and sense of personal failure serve the same function as medieval teachings about feminine weakness. They convince women that their struggles are individual failings rather than systemic problems. Professional dress codes, networking expectations, and advancement criteria all operate as modern versions of medieval sumptuary laws, dictating how women should present their bodies and personalities to succeed in male-dominated environments. The message is the same as it was centuries ago: conform to expectations set by others, and you might be rewarded with limited autonomy within carefully controlled boundaries. The medical establishment continues to play a crucial role in controlling women's bodies through theories and practices that echo medieval approaches to female anatomy. Women's pain is still dismissed, their symptoms minimized, and their concerns attributed to emotional instability in ways that would be familiar to any medieval physician. The language has changed. Hysteria has been replaced by psychosomatic disorders and attention-seeking behavior. But the underlying assumption remains the same. Women's bodies are inherently unreliable, and women themselves cannot be trusted to understand their own physical experiences. Modern reproductive medicine, despite its technological advances, still operates on principles that prioritize potential pregnancies over women's immediate health and comfort. Contraceptive side effects that would be considered unacceptable in medications for men are dismissed as minor inconveniences that women should tolerate for the greater good. Fertility treatments subject women to physical and emotional ordeals that are justified by the assumption that motherhood is every woman's ultimate desire and highest purpose. The legal system has evolved beyond the crude property laws of medieval times, but it still struggles to recognize women as fully autonomous agents when it comes to their own bodies. Debates about reproductive rights, sexual consent, and bodily autonomy are conducted in language that treats women's bodies as public property, subject to regulation by others. The medieval concept that women's reproductive capacity belongs to the community rather than to the women themselves persists in modern form. Educational institutions continue the medieval tradition of channeling women toward roles and subjects deemed appropriate for their gender. Though the mechanisms have become more subtle, girls are encouraged to be collaborative rather than competitive, to focus on helping others rather than achieving for themselves, and to prioritize relationships over individual accomplishment. These messages are presented as recognizing and celebrating feminine strengths, but they serve the same function as medieval teachings. They limit women's aspirations and ensure their continued subordination. The entertainment industry has replaced medieval literature and religious art as the primary source of cultural narratives about women's proper roles. Movies, television shows, books, and music still predominantly feature stories where women find fulfillment through relationships with men and through motherhood, while depicting women who prioritize their own goals and ambitions as either tragic figures who learn the error of their ways or villains whose independence makes them dangerous and unnatural. Religious institutions, even those that have officially embraced gender equality, continue to promote interpretations of sacred texts and traditions that emphasize women's roles as supporters of men rather than independent spiritual beings. The language of complementarity has replaced explicit subordination, but the practical effect remains the same. Women are assigned supporting roles in religious hierarchies and encouraged to find their spiritual fulfillment through service to others rather than through their own direct relationship with the divine. The financial system operates in ways that ensure women's continued economic dependence despite legal equality. The gender pay gap, occupational segregation, and the systematic undervaluing of work traditionally performed by women all serve to maintain economic structures that echo medieval arrangements where women could not support themselves independently. The modern welfare state and social safety net, while providing crucial support, also create systems where women's access to resources depends on their relationships with men or their status as mothers, rather than their rights as independent individuals. Perhaps most insidiously, modern culture has learned to co-opt the language of feminism and women's liberation to sell the same old restrictions in new packaging. Women are told that choosing to prioritize family over career is feminist if it's truly their choice, ignoring the ways that economic necessity, social pressure, and limited support systems constrain those choices. They're told that embracing traditional feminine roles is empowering if it's done consciously, overlooking how cultural conditioning shapes what feels natural and desirable. The self-help industry has created a massive market around helping women optimize themselves according to standards that, upon examination, serve others' interests more than their own. Books, workshops, and online courses promise to help women find balance, achieve success, and maintain relationships while looking perfect and feeling grateful for the opportunity to do it all. These resources rarely question whether the expectations women are struggling to meet are reasonable or beneficial. They simply offer more efficient ways to comply with them. Social movements that claim to advance women's interests often operate within frameworks that preserve fundamental power imbalances. The focus on individual empowerment and personal choice obscures systemic issues that require collective action to address. Women are encouraged to lean in, to negotiate better for themselves, and to take personal responsibility for their advancement, while the structures that create inequality remain largely unchanged. The psychological sophistication of these modern control mechanisms far exceeds anything medieval society achieved. Today's systems don't just control women's behavior, they shape their desires, aspirations, and understanding of themselves in ways that make resistance seem not just difficult, but actually undesirable. Women internalize standards and expectations so completely that they become their own most effective enforcers, policing their own thoughts and behaviors according to criteria that serve others' interests. The medieval woman who sat in her chamber contemplating her approaching marriage at least understood that her autonomy was being taken from her. Modern women often don't recognize their constraints as constraints because they've been so successfully reframed as choices, opportunities, and expressions of feminine power. But just as medieval women found ways to resist and subvert the systems designed to control them, modern women are developing new forms of resistance that work within and around contemporary control mechanisms. They're learning to recognize manipulation disguised as empowerment, to question narratives that seem to celebrate their freedom while actually limiting their options, and to build networks of support that operate independently of male-controlled institutions. The challenge is greater now because the systems are more sophisticated, but so are the tools available for resistance. Communication technologies that can be used for surveillance and control can also be used to build communities of women who support each other's genuine autonomy. Educational opportunities that can be used to channel women into predetermined roles can also be used to develop critical thinking skills that expose the mechanisms of oppression. Legal frameworks that can be used to regulate women's bodies can also be used to protect women's rights when applied consistently and fairly. The key insight from studying medieval control systems is that they were never as total or effective as they appeared. Every system of oppression creates its own contradictions and vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand its logic. The women who learned to manipulate medieval systems while appearing to submit to them were laying groundwork for the expanded freedoms that later generations would enjoy. Today's women face the same challenge: how to navigate systems designed to control them while working to create better options for future generations. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental struggle remains the same. Understanding how these systems operate, recognizing them as systems rather than natural arrangements, is the first step toward developing effective resistance. The story of that medieval woman in her chamber, contemplating a future where her body would be controlled by others, isn't ancient history. It's a continuing reality for women around the world who live under systems that have learned to disguise control as care, oppression as protection, and subjugation as empowerment. Their struggles and resistance strategies connect them across centuries to women who faced similar challenges and found ways to preserve their humanity despite overwhelming odds. The techniques perfected in medieval Europe for controlling female bodies without touching them haven't disappeared. They've simply become invisible to those who mistake sophistication for progress. Recognizing this continuity is essential for understanding not just the past, but the present and future of women's ongoing struggle for genuine autonomy and equality.